James Thornton was a man who had everything money could buy: luxurious cars, a sprawling mansion, a private jet, and a reputation for being untouchably successful. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of wealth, he felt a certain emptiness he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the detachment from people, the constant pretense, or the fact that his achievements often left him surrounded by superficial relationships. On a crisp Tuesday morning, he noticed Clara, his longtime housemaid, moving quietly around the mansion. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with hands roughened by years of labor, and a gentle dignity that made her seem almost invisible to most people, except to James. He had known Clara for over a decade, yet he realized he knew very little about her life outside the walls of his opulent home. She never complained, always smiled politely, and carried herself with the quiet resilience of someone who had endured hardship without losing grace. That day, something in James stirred, a curiosity, yes, but also a deep sense of empathy he rarely allowed himself. He decided, without a word, to leave his office after work and follow Clara from a distance. He wanted to see her world, the life she returned to when the walls of his mansion were behind her, and the facade of wealth no longer mattered. Clara walked with a purposeful pace through the streets of the city. Her modest coat, worn at the elbows, could not shield her from the biting cold, and her shoes were clearly past their prime. She carried a small tote bag filled with groceries, the weight of it balanced delicately on her shoulder. James kept to the shadows, his expensive tailored suit making him an unlikely observer in the quiet alleys and bustling streets that Clara navigated with the precision of someone used to surviving. He watched her enter a tiny, weathered building at the edge of the city. The exterior was peeling, the windows fogged with condensation, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood and cooking fires. Clara's footsteps echoed softly as she climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor. She opened a door marked with chipped paint and entered what appeared to be a small, humble apartment. Through the cracked door, James could see a modest kitchen with a single light bulb casting a warm glow over a table that had seen better days. Inside, Clara began her evening routine. She carefully put away the groceries, talking softly to her two grandchildren who had been waiting eagerly for her return. Their laughter filled the room, bouncing off the walls and momentarily chasing away the weight of exhaustion that seemed to cling to Clara's shoulders. James felt a lump form in his throat. Here was a woman who had given so much of herself to others, yet her own life was marked by struggle and sacrifice. He realized that all the money in the world could never have provided her the peace or comfort that her small apartment and family brought her. As the evening wore on, James watched Clara help her grandchildren with their homework, preparing simple meals, and attending to their needs with unwavering patience. She spoke little of her own challenges, never mentioning the long hours she spent working in the homes of others, including his own, nor the financial strain she endured. It was clear that her life was far from easy. There were stacks of bills on a side table, worn clothing that needed mending, and a small calendar marked with reminders of appointments she could barely afford. Yet, despite it all, Clara's face radiated warmth, love, and an unspoken dignity that James had never fully appreciated until now. Moved by the intimate glimpse into her world, James felt something shift within him. The barriers he had built around himself, the ones that separated him from ordinary struggles, ordinary people, and ordinary kindness, began to crumble. For the first time, he truly saw Clara not just as a maid, but as a human being whose life carried burdens that no wealth could erase. He realized that his money and influence could offer her comfort, security, and opportunities she had long been denied. Tears pricked his eyes as he retreated from the doorway, careful not to be seen. The sight of Clara's quiet strength and unwavering devotion to her family left an indelible mark on his heart. He understood that her life was not defined by her hardships but by the love and resilience she carried, despite every obstacle. That evening, James returned to his mansion with a new perspective, one that would soon translate into action. He knew he could no longer remain a distant observer of her life. Something had to change, and he was determined to ensure that Clara, the woman who had spent years serving others, would finally experience the care, respect, and security she so richly deserved. James Thornton had never felt so deeply unsettled by what he had witnessed. The image of Clara, his longtime maid, quietly tending to her grandchildren in a cramped apartment, weighed on him more heavily than any business deal or philanthropic endeavor ever had. That evening, after returning to his mansion, he paced his study, trying to reconcile the stark contrast between her life and his own. How could someone so selfless, so full of dignity, endure so much hardship while maintaining a warm smile and unshakable patience? He realized he had never truly appreciated the sacrifices she had made over the years, the invisible labor that had sustained his household, nor the resilience it took to return home each day to a life of struggle. The next morning, James made a quiet decision. He would not confront her immediately, not in a way that would embarrass or unsettle her. Clara deserved respect, not charity wrapped in pity. He began researching discreet ways to help her, ways that would provide security without undermining her dignity. He contacted agencies, looked into housing assistance, and even spoke to his private accountant about how to set up a fund that would cover her bills and her grandchildren's education. Every step he considered brought him closer to understanding the depth of her resilience, and the magnitude of the disparity between their lives. That evening, James returned to the apartment building. He parked a block away and watched as Clara arrived, carrying the same worn tote bag filled with groceries. She moved with the same quiet determination, unaware of the silent observer in the shadows. He noted every detail, the tired lines on her face, the careful way she balanced the bag, the way her grandchildren's faces lit up at her arrival. It was as though he were seeing her life in slow motion, appreciating the rhythm and grace in the midst of struggle. As she opened the door and stepped inside, James realized how much courage it must take to face life with so little comfort or recognition. The apartment, modest as it was, felt alive with love. Clara immediately knelt to hug her grandchildren, their laughter filling the small space. She cooked a simple meal, humming softly, and then sat with them at the table, guiding them through homework, answering questions patiently, and offering encouragement with every word. Watching her, James felt a mix of admiration and sorrow. He could not comprehend how someone could endure so much yet remain so giving, so centered on the needs of others. Over the next few weeks, James continued to follow Clara from a distance, always careful not to intrude. He watched her visit the local clinic, pay bills at the small community office, and speak gently with neighbors who seemed to rely on her kindness as much as her family did. Each glimpse into her daily life revealed a new layer of struggle, trips to the pharmacy she could barely afford, fixing leaks in her apartment herself, or walking miles to save on transportation. Yet, through it all, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that left James in awe. One day, he witnessed a moment that changed everything. Clara's youngest grandchild fell ill, and she rushed him to the emergency room, carrying him in her arms while juggling the tote bag and her coat. Her face was pale with worry, but she never faltered. James, watching from a distance, could feel his chest tighten. Here was a woman whose life was a constant balancing act, whose every day involved sacrifices most could never imagine. He felt an overwhelming urge to intervene, to offer support in any way possible. Finally, James decided the time had come. He could no longer remain hidden, watching from afar. He approached Clara's apartment the next evening, carrying a discreet envelope with details of assistance he had arranged, covering rent, utilities, groceries, and her grandchildren's school fees. He knocked lightly, and when she opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. James spoke softly, explaining that he had come to help, not out of obligation but out of deep respect and gratitude for everything she had done and endured. Clara, stunned, stepped back, unsure how to respond. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the magnitude of his gesture. It was not charity in the traditional sense, it was recognition of her life, her sacrifices, and her unwavering strength. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel seen, appreciated, and supported. She tried to protest, to maintain her humility, but James gently insisted that she accept the help, assuring her that she deserved it. Over the following weeks, Clara's life began to change quietly. The constant stress of bills and uncertainty eased, and she could focus more on her grandchildren and herself. She never let her pride waver, continuing to cook, clean, and care for her family with the same love and patience as before. But now, she did so with a newfound peace, knowing that someone had seen her struggle and responded with genuine care. James, in turn, felt a transformation within himself. Witnessing her resilience and quietly supporting her allowed him to experience a sense of fulfillment and connection he had never felt amid his wealth and power. The bond between them grew, built not on dependence or power but on respect, empathy, and shared humanity. James had entered Clara's life as a silent observer, moved by her hardship, and left as a man forever changed, learning that true wealth was measured not by money, but by the capacity to care, to see, and to act with compassion toward those whose lives too often went unnoticed. After weeks of quietly observing Clara's life from a distance, James Thornton could no longer suppress the mix of emotions that had taken root within him. Every evening he had followed her, every glimpse of her quiet struggle and unwavering dedication, had chipped away at the emotional walls he had built around himself. He realized that wealth, power, and influence, as commanding as they were, had never exposed him to the raw, unfiltered reality of human resilience. Clara's life had become a mirror, reflecting both his privilege and the invisible burdens carried by those who served people like him. That realization was heavy but strangely liberating. It was a rainy Thursday evening when James decided to confront the truth within himself. He had watched Clara leave the mansion that morning, carrying her modest bag of groceries, her coat buttoned tightly against the cold. In her posture, he saw exhaustion tempered by determination. She had waved politely to the neighbor children, shared a few kind words with a passerby, and moved through the streets with a quiet dignity he had never truly appreciated before. Today, he would not follow from afar. Today, he would step into her life, not as a secret observer, but as someone prepared to act with intention. Clara's apartment building was quiet when he arrived. The dim light of a single street lamp reflected off the puddles on the pavement, creating a subtle glow on the cracked sidewalk. He entered the lobby, his polished shoes sounding foreign in the worn space. Each step seemed amplified, echoing off the walls lined with faded paint and chipped edges. He paused before her door, rehearsing the words he had planned, but even as he tried to steady himself, he knew nothing he said could truly capture the depth of respect he felt for her. When Clara opened the door, she looked surprised to see him standing there. Her eyes widened, taking in the tailored suit, the expensive watch, and the unfamiliar expression on his usually composed face. James spoke softly, his voice carrying a sincerity he had never used in the business meetings and high-stakes negotiations that defined his life. He told her that he had been observing her life, not to judge, not to pity, but to understand and appreciate the resilience and sacrifices she had made. Clara's initial reaction was confusion. She had never imagined that her life, so ordinary in her own eyes, could hold such significance for the man she had served for over a decade. As James spoke, detailing the ways he wanted to help her, covering rent, utilities, groceries, and her grandchildren's schooling, her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth to protest, to insist that she could manage, but he interrupted gently, explaining that this was not charity, but recognition of her strength, her dedication, and the quiet courage she displayed every day. He paused, allowing her to absorb the gravity of his words. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope he had brought, and in that moment, James felt a profound shift within himself. He had always believed that wealth and influence defined success, yet here was a woman whose life, untouched by the luxuries he prized, had taught him more about courage, integrity, and human dignity than any boardroom or investment ever could. The tears in her eyes mirrored the silent gratitude he felt swelling within his chest. In the following days, James made subtle adjustments to Clara's life. He arranged for repairs in her apartment, hired tutors for her grandchildren, and ensured she had access to medical care whenever needed. Yet, he was careful not to impose or overstep, allowing her to maintain autonomy over her daily routines. Clara, in turn, continued her work at his mansion with the same grace and dedication as before, but now there was an unspoken bond between them, one rooted in mutual respect, understanding, and a shared acknowledgement of hardship and resilience. James also began to see his own world differently. He noticed the small gestures of kindness and sacrifice in people around him, something he had previously ignored in his pursuit of wealth and status. Meetings no longer felt hollow, and social gatherings seemed less superficial. The lessons he learned from Clara's life, her patience, her commitment, her unwavering love for her family, became a guiding principle for how he interacted with the world. The emptiness he had once felt was slowly replaced by a sense of connection, purpose, and empathy he had never known. One evening, as he watched Clara tuck her grandchildren into bed, he realized that the wealth he had accumulated over decades had always been secondary to the wealth of human connection, understanding, and compassion. Clara had never asked for recognition or reward, she had simply lived her life with dignity, kindness, and courage. Yet, through his silent observation, he had come to understand that her life, though marked by struggle, held lessons far more valuable than any fortune could buy. The emotional awakening James experienced that night became a turning point. He no longer measured life in terms of assets or influence but in terms of the impact he could have on those who, like Clara, lived with quiet strength and unacknowledged sacrifice. And as he left her apartment that evening, stepping back into the rain-soaked streets, he carried with him not just a plan to help, but a profound respect for the resilience of the human spirit, a lesson he would never forget.